Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, Donald Trump is back, and he's making lots of people very nervous, both within and outside the United States. The Democrat-leaning pundits have now gone into the how and why of what has happened. It's a list of ABC and XYZ and all of the above. But frankly, it's like the blindfolded men trying to figure out the elephant. There's just too many variables to figure out the entire elephant, at least at this point. That's what I call the frustratingly fascinating complexity of human affairs. There's also much speculation about who Trump is. The late Wayne Barrett was an investigative reporter and observed Trump and his real estate business deals for almost 25 years and wrote a definitive book, was on the money when he said, everyone else in the movie that Donald is making with his life is just an extra. And Barrett died just a day before Trump took oath on January 20th, 2017. It's almost like he timed it with that. Lots of analysts think Trump is mercurial and transactional, that he doesn't understand policy, certainly not foreign policy. The implication perhaps is that he's inconsistent. Frankly, and of course I'm going to hear from my panelists, my own sense is that he's quite consistent in his worldview. For instance, he doesn't like the liberal international order and thinks America has got a raw deal. He doesn't like NATO, that's for sure. By his own account, he loves tariffs and thinks it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary and needs its own PR firm. That's because he doesn't like the global economy. Oh, and he, of course, likes strongmen. That seems quite consistent to me, especially if we juxtapose all of this with what he did in his previous tenure. The Heritage Foundation already has a tome out, the Agenda 2025, and if the recommendations contained therein are anything to go by, Trump would like to be a strongman at home and reshape the federal government and federal institutions. Meanwhile, the world has, since he was last in office, it was a whole lot less complicated at that time. There was no war in Europe, and the Middle East seemed quiet and promising. He basically had to deal with China. The world has since become much more dangerous, and it will be even more dangerous by Jan 20th, 2025, when he takes oath of office. But let's get to our panelists in and for some heavy lifting. That's why I've invited them. I have with me Barbara Slavin, who's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. Christopher Clary, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany. Marc Saxer, who heads the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in the Asia-Pacific region. And Ilhan Niaz, who's a professor of history at the Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. But these are very short bios, but time is short, so I have eschewed detailing the books all of them have written. I'm sure they can live with this brevity. So welcome to this program, to the Trump world once again. Barbara, let me begin with you. Specifically, so we know he behaved in a certain way with reference to the Middle East and also Iran, and that's your area. You have a long and illustrious career in journalism, analyzing, and now, of course, you teach also, and you're part of the policy community. How do you think Trump is going to behave this time? Because as I said, last time he was in office, he actually, through Jared Kushner, did things and pursued a policy which seemed promising, frankly, to the point where Joe Biden, the self-declared proud Irish Zionist, pursued with even much greater vigor. So is something going to change now that the Middle East is no more promising and is on fire?
First of all, thanks for having me back with such illustrious company. Look, the most positive outcome is that we finally see at least long-term ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon. His election coincides, frankly, with exhaustion on all parts of the Middle East with the wars that have been going on for more than a year. And even the Israelis, I think, are looking for exit strategies. So I would predict that there would be ceasefires. There isn't anything left to hit in Gaza, frankly, after what the Israelis have done there. And I think there is concern about what is going on in Lebanon and that it not continue. 1 million people displaced, over 3,000 dead in Lebanon now. So that is the positive interpretation, that there will be more incentive to wind down these wars. Certainly, if not by the time Trump takes office, then shortly thereafter. As far as Iran is concerned, there will be a very harsh policy, I think, at least initially, maximum pressure 2.0, as it's being called, an effort to stiffen enforcement of existing sanctions, which will probably involve going after Chinese companies, which are the major importers of Iranian oil at this point. But Trump has said he is open to negotiate.
So that kind of brings in the Iran-China policy. There's a certain kind of overlap there also.
Yeah, well, I think the Chinese will sacrifice the Iranians if they think it will help them in their other disputes, and there will be many of them, particularly over tariffs with the Trump administration. I think the Iranians know that, frankly. Iran is in a very weak position, so it may seek to negotiate with the United States over the nuclear program, which of course has advanced very rapidly since Trump quit the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. We have another factor, which is what will the GCC states, and primarily Saudi Arabia and the UAE, be looking for from the Trump administration. And here we may see some effort, again, to press for negotiations between the US and Iran, because the Gulf states don't want to get caught in the crossfire again between the US and Iran. Israel itself will continue its settlement policies. I would predict that unless Trump gives a firm no, we will see Israeli efforts to resettle Gaza, particularly the north, and to continue expansion in the West Bank and possibly move for annexation of the West Bank.
Right.
That is the trend. And I'm not sure that Trump will stop them.
Right. So the dog stays in the well, and up until the dog stays in the well, the water cannot be purified, no matter how many purification plants you construct downstream, if you will. But there are a number of other questions that obviously have been thrown up by your response to my question. We'll get to that, but I want to do a round before we get back to round two. So, Marc, Europe, and starting with Germany, of course, which is your home country. Almost, it was almost like it was synchronized that Trump will win and the German governing coalition will unravel. So just give me a sense of, and also in the backdrop of, as I said in my opening, with reference to how Trump looks at NATO, how Trump says that America is overstretched and we need to sort of get back, and the way he had previously has been forcing the NATO allies, especially the European NATO allies, to spend more on defense, et cetera, et cetera. So give me your quick take on how do you think he is going to approach this? And now I'm deliberately not talking about the Russo-Ukraine war right now. I will get to that, but first, Europe.
Well, I mean, Europe has been actually in a tight spot even before the election for a couple of years now already. And if you wish, then Trump is basically a firecracker that you put into that situation now. Europe is in a tight spot because there is a new geopolitics, the return of great power politics, where it's actually ill-suited to tackle. Not supposed to talk about the war in Ukraine, but the return of war to Europe is obviously a complete change of the scenery. a country like Germany will have to rebuild its deterrence, will have to rebuild its industrial foundation actually for deterrence, and it will have to rebuild the abilities to do so. That in itself is already a task that's going to take 10 to 15 years. And at the same time, the German economy is in dire straits, also due to the shift of geoeconomic competition. It's an export-oriented, manufacturing-oriented economy. Basically, we said you had cheap security from the U.S., cheap gas from Russia, and expensive cars to China. That's the German economy, if you want. All of that is over at the same time. So you basically have a situation where you're going to have to invest considerable amounts of resources. I estimate for an annual additional investment in such things as defense, industrial base, and infrastructure of 4% GDP. And at the same time, your economic engine is stuttering. And that's going to be a formidable political challenge. Personally, I believe that this is actually too big of a challenge for the current social contract, and it will create enormous political upheavals all over Europe. And now Trump enters this, and it's going to be faster, more disruptive, less collegial in that sense. It will just reinforce those trends. And I think Europe is really not prepared for that.
Right. A number of questions are again thrown up, but let's get to Chris and to our part of the world, South Asia. Chris, how do you look at Trump 2.0 and South Asia?
Compared to Europe, I expect South Asia policy to be characterized by greater continuity. The U.S.-Pakistan relationship has been broken since at least 2011. And Trump did a little bit to break it more and did a little bit to repair it during his last 4 years. And I don't think he thinks about Pakistan very much. At the end of the day, my read of the man is he has a few instincts. He's looking to make a deal. He thinks of things in terms of wins and losses for him personally, and maybe the U.S. as a secondary side effect for that. And it's hard for me to imagine that, I think the problem for Pakistan is that Pakistan doesn't bring a lot to the table. Pakistan typically offers a U.S. president the possibility that Pakistan won't fail further. And I just don't think that's a threat that Trump cares about that much. I don't think he's worried about the risks that Pakistan generates. He might be willing to consider other things Pakistan has on offer, but those mostly relate to Pakistan's sort of space next to Afghanistan, or conceivably, things like artillery for Ukraine doesn't even really interest Trump. And in contrast, the issue is India, I think, for Trump has more to offer. I read this morning in the Indian press, there's a new Trump real estate deal in India. So there's what we might call parochial benefits for President Trump. And India, because it's not been a large, it's taken US aid, but less than other states. And then it has also been a provider, and it has provided things on China. And the big irritant in US-India relations under Biden and to some extent under Obama has been concerns about human rights and democracy and the protection of minorities in India. And Trump just doesn't care. They could care less. In fact, everything that he says about Prime Minister Modi suggests that he might even appreciate what Modi is doing. He says he's a really nice guy, but he's also a killer. And it's clear when Trump is talking in the podcast that being a killer is not something that Trump views as pejorative.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, I might sound semi-facetious, but I'm actually serious with reference to, because you mentioned this Trump real estate deal in India. Now, we used to have that useless golden arches theory by Friedman. Let me offer the Trump Tower theory. If we were, in theory, to offer Trump to build Trump Towers, whether with mafia money or whatever, as Barrett investigated, in Lahore or in Islamabad, do you think that's going to make any difference, parochial as it might be?
that I think the challenge for Pakistan is what it can offer in terms of real estate deals could perhaps be more corrupt than what another state might be able to offer. But the Pakistani economy needs to grow at greater than 3% or whatever figure you want to optimistically give Pakistan for this year. Faster growing economies in Saudi Arabia or India, or they're going to be on offer for more. But I think it's clear that Trump thinks about a lot of the world in terms of a real estate pitch. Not least, there's an old video you can find online of when he's trying to convince Kim Jong-un to give up its nuclear weapons. It's all a video of where the U.S. government produced some effort, what looks like a timeshare condo ad for North Korea, and it didn't work for North Korea, but I think it does suggest how the incoming and former president might think about the world.
Okay. Ilhan, let's talk climate. Now, of course, we know that President Biden, rhetoric aside, didn't do much about climate, the number of oil drilling and the rest of it, as we know. But Trump is obviously overtly a denier. I mean, he doesn't believe that there is a climate crisis. Do you think that is going to open up space for other global climate deniers, or the big corporations that obviously get their money through oil and gas drillings and exporting them and the rest of it? I mean,
whether if you look at, for example, U.S. Oil production, I think that's increased from something like 5 million barrels per day in 2008 to about 13 million barrels per day at present. And you can look at U.S. natural gas production that has also shown a steady increase, regardless of who happens to be in government. Biden, if I remember correctly, this was back in March 2022, he actually boasted that there are something like 9,000 unused oil drilling licenses that can be availed of by the oil and gas industry, and that it is completely wrong to accuse him or his administration of trying to impede the energy security of the United States. So I think that at this point, unfortunately, in our overall global civilizational journey, there are two types of climate denial that are on offer. One is the climate denial of the Democrats, which is that we accept the science but won't do anything about it. And the other is the climate denial of people like Trump, who say that, well, we don't really buy the science and we're not going to do anything about it. So as far as the planet is concerned, it doesn't really matter whether you believe in climate change or not if you're not going to do anything about it, because then it means you're more or less locked into a plus 2 to 3 degrees Celsius global heating trajectory by the end of this century, which will basically disrupt the global agricultural cycle and more or less terminate human civilization as we understand it today. So in that respect, I don't think that the United States had any serious intent of abiding by the 1.5 degree goal, nor did any other major power for that matter. So it's not like the Americans are alone in this. The Chinese aren't interested in it. The Indians aren't interested in it. The Russians aren't interested in it. Everyone has their own particular set of exemptions and excuses that they use to justify not taking effective action. So in that respect, I don't really think it will have that much of an impact as far as climate policy is concerned.
Okay. Barbara, back to the Middle East. So one of the things that we noticed last time Mr. Trump was around, the Israelis went on a spending spree, increasing settlements and, building settlements. His ambassador, Friedman, Friedman's daughter actually, and he boasted about it, she made Aliyah while he was the ambassador there. And he was constantly pictured with the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others. And then he shut down the PLO office in Washington. He sort of decades-old policy of the U.S. policy of not shifting the embassy to Jerusalem. He did that. And then, of course, he had this grand design, which resulted in the first phase of Abraham Accords, which was that, get normalization from the Arab states, the Gulf states, and essentially to present the Palestinians as if the Palestinians do not exist. What's happening in Gaza does not happen. What's happening in the West Bank and the occupied Palestinian territories does not. And much before the Israelis basically banned UNRWA, he was the one who cut funding for UNRWA. So my point is, and so he basically says he doesn't like wars, but to the extent of the Middle East, he actually did things which led to 7th October. Because the idea that Israel can live in peace without rolling back its slow, structured violence against the Palestinians, which is not something that I am talking about, which is something which has been recorded by Israeli organizations, by UN organizations, by a number of other organizations. If he tries to subtract the Palestinians once again from the ceasefires that you're talking about, while also putting pressure on Iran, I do not see how the Middle East can get back to some kind of balance, because it's not going to happen.
Well, I disagree a little bit. I think the level of exhaustion is so high now, certainly in Gaza, Lebanon, that a respite from violence would be welcomed, I think, on all sides. The problem is what comes after that. And the Israeli right is in power and likely to remain in power. Certainly through 2026, they're not supposed to hold new elections until then. And while there is a strong movement of opposition to Netanyahu within Israel, it's not strong enough to bring down his government. Netanyahu has spoken to Trump 3 times in the last 3 days. Yeah. So he
was very openly, overtly banking on a Trump. Yeah.
He's very closely coordinating his steps with Trump.
Yeah.
So we may not see, full-blown annexation immediately, but there will be settlers in Gaza, clearly. The movement Gush Emunim, several of the others are already preparing for that.
Yeah.
And that's why they've ethnically cleansed, essentially, North Gaza. So that will start. And of course, the settlers will continue their attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, pushing more and more of them off their land. And with the full support of the United States. I mean, I think we just have to understand this is what's going to happen. So the only question in my mind is, what do the Gulf states do? What does Saudi Arabia do? I don't think they can normalize with Israel under these conditions. But I don't think they're going to be able to really fight it in a meaningful way. I think the most they can do is try to prevent a U.S. and Israeli war with Iran, which would obviously further destabilize the region and make, Vision 2030 even more visionary than it already is. The Gulf states want quiet so they can continue their economic activities. That's what they want. They want ceasefires so the Houthis will stop firing on shipping in the Red Sea. And that's probably where we're going.
Well, okay. So I take your point, and it's also a clarification on my part with reference to my question. There is exhaustion, obviously. Gaza has been, you might not agree with it, but that's what the ICJ says. That's what the UN rapporteur says. The rest of it has been a genocidal policy. So exhaustion is there, and I take that point. But I had a broader point, which was that if Trump were to do what you have also said that he will likely do, ceasefires notwithstanding, there's not going to be peace in this region.
No, there will be guerrilla warfare. There will be continued terrorism, all the things that have plagued the region, frankly, forever. But, Israel has decimated Hamas, has hobbled Hezbollah. Iran is in an extremely weak position now. It's not just that they have borne the brunt of Israeli missile strikes most recently, but their own government is extremely unpopular. The economy is very shaky. And so this is a moment of extreme vulnerability, I think, on the Islamic Republic's side. They're not in a position to really revive the axis of resistance. So, of course, there will still be violence, but it will be scattered and sporadic, not organized in the way that we saw. And, Hamas is not, there is no organization that could mount an attack like the one of October 7th, 2023. That's not going to happen. I think, I have any hope at all, and I don't have much. It will come from within Israel, where people will be so disgusted by Netanyahu and by his lies and his crimes that eventually it will turn against him. But that's going to take a while. He has Trump behind it.
Yeah, we still have to see what happens on 2nd December when he goes before the High Court of Justice for his hearings. His office is already trying to get that postponed because his argument is that 4 or 5 days a week in the court for 4 or 5 hours is not going to cut because I'm fighting a war. But leaving that aside, Hamas and Hezbollah have been degraded to a large extent. There's no denying that. But I won't say that they've been decimated. The Israelis, for instance, in Lebanon, have not been able to achieve the war objectives that they had set for themselves. This whole idea of somehow bringing in the Lebanese army and getting Hezbollah to go north of Litani, that's not going to, Hezbollah has already rejected that. But let's see how this works out. Let's get to Europe now. So, Marc, I was reading this report put out by the Council on the European Council on Foreign Relations with reference to Scholz's famous Zeitenwende speech and the 100 billion one-time fund that was to be spent on basically modernizing the Bundeswehr and the rest of it. And they said it's dead. It hasn't gone anywhere. And because of a number of issues, political instability, economic downturn, the rise of the far right, and also the far left, and a number of other factors. So using Germany both as an example, as a real-life example within Europe, and also as a metaphor for Europe overall, since this is the strongest economy in Europe right now. Trying very hard to get to the Italian model, but nonetheless, still very, very strong. So if Trump decides to pull back, and we can bring in the Russo-Ukraine war now, if he tries to pull back, is Germany in a position to actually bear the major burden of this war and generally lead Europe? I'm still using Europe as a collective noun, although I'm very skeptical of using it as a collective noun.
Well, I mean, you're going right to the point where the German government collapsed, right? Basically, on the very evening when Donald Trump won the election. Basically, let me just get back to what I said earlier. I think it's important to understand the political economy of this. We are talking 4% GDP. The 100 billion that you talked about, didn't Germany even get to 2% GDP? It wasn't even enough for that, right? So it's a considerable bigger challenge. It's actually comparable only to the reunification 30 years ago. It's the last time Germany did anything of this magnitude that needs to be done. There is no popular understanding of this. Basically, there is a mood very similar to most Western European countries, actually, that people have a very clear understanding, not clear understanding, but they have a pretty good guess that things cannot stay as they were and that they're going to get worse for them. There is a mood that actually believes that the establishment, the liberal establishment, is not telling the full truth of the problems. And there is a fear, which is also partly justified, that they're going to be the ones who bear the cost, both in terms of money, when you cut the welfare and increase the taxes, as well at some point, by giving the lives of their sons and daughters. So that's the overall mood. And in this mood, you basically have to make a pitch that there is a new security threat on your eastern flank and you have to support Ukraine and so on, right? So basically the populace is not convinced. That's the first problem. Second, your industrial base is not there in order to pull this off, what you need to do. It had been degraded over the last 30 years. So you basically have a money problem, you have an industrial problem, you have a legitimacy problem at the same time. That's why Germany is slower than what it needs to be, right? It will continue to be slower than what it needs to be. And I think there are significant challenges for other European countries as well. So now Trump comes in and basically is going to do what he does, either make a dirty deal, Taliban style, or you're basically going to hand over the brunt of the shift of the burden to Europeans quasi overnight. Europe is not prepared for that, not militarily, either not financially prepared for that. So that is going to create a lot of trouble. I think, and maybe that's also a conversation that we can have with the other panelists here, what we see emerging is a world of three geopolitical theaters that are interconnected, and there's interplays between them, right? So for Germany, the problem is that the US is at danger of an overstretch. The Biden administration already knew that. That's why they tried to play somehow nice with the Chinese and tried to be somewhat on the brakes, both in Ukraine as well in the Middle East, right? But that's only going to go so far. The Russians are making their moves to North Korea as well as in the Middle East. The Chinese are happy that the US is exhausting itself all the way in the West. And these games are going to go on. So if what Barbara is saying comes to pass, and there is going to be maybe a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon, but we're going to have maybe an escalation of the conflict in Iran, that is going to have direct ramifications for the Ukraine war in Europe. Direct, right? Because there is this trade-off between these two theaters of conflict. And I think that's the kind of geopolitics that we have to look at. And like I said, Europe is ill-prepared to tackle that.
That's a very important point. But let me ask you this, Marc. We really don't know what the blueprint here is. Well, Trump has said that he's going to end the Russo-Ukraine war in 24 hours. But leaving aside the hyperbole part of it, J.D. Vance has actually put out some salient points with reference to what could likely happen, which is that they freeze the status quo. When the Russians get to, and Crimea is not even part of that discussion, by the way. The Russians retain what they have captured. And there's going to be, so somewhere along the Dnipro, you're going to have a demilitarized zone, which will be manned by a multinational European force. And Ukraine keeps the rest of it. And so, and I'm not sure if the Ukrainians will accept that, but if Trump cuts off the military and financial aid, it then becomes a very simple issue of sustainment, which obviously Kyiv cannot sustain the war effort on its own. And I'm not so sure how many of the European states will be able to step up to the plate and actually fill that gaping hole, which will be left when, if and when the United States withdraws that support. So I just want to get your take on that.
Well, I think the real hole is, of course, weapons and financial support, but I think the real decisive factor here is demographics, and it's the human resources. So I think Ukraine has reached the end of its mobilization power. Russia may be at some point too, by the way, especially when there's internal politics that Putin has exhausted its minorities and prison populations. But that's another question because it's so much bigger, right? But that's the real squeeze that we're seeing. When it comes to Ukraine, I think that on a strategic level, the war is actually ready to settle because all major powers and all major parties to that war have either achieved what they wanted to achieve, or they do know that they will not be able to achieve it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Russia has made its point, right? And it's probably going to walk away with no NATO membership for Ukraine. Ukraine will survive as a sovereign state, maybe a rump state, but it will survive as a sovereign state. The US had significantly weakened Russia militarily as well as demographically. And Western Europe actually needs to get out of this bind because we're dying geoeconomically and economically, as well as our security order has collapsed, right? So basically, for all the major players, there is not much more to gain if this thing goes on for another year or two, and there is a lot to lose, actually. I think the problem is that while strategically it's settled, tactically it's very difficult to get out of this. First of all, a lot of people have to climb down from the trees. I mean, in that sense, democracy is a beautiful thing. So you have a new government in the US, and you can now all cry foul over the new president's going to do some stuff that secretly, I think a lot of people have been talking about before already. But basically, it will be in the nitty gritty. I think the proposal that you just cited is the first opening salvo of a negotiation that's going to happen now. And, I think, it's not going to be pretty. That I think we can all agree.
Right. So, Chris, Marc made this excellent point about these sort of, if you look at these three tectonic plates, if you will, they're kind of pushing against each other. So you do one thing and, you exacerbate the problem elsewhere. In terms of Trump's approach to India, specifically in light of what Trump's going to do with China, I think that's frankly the easiest part of this, because we really know what he did last time and we really know what he's planning to do this time. He's actually said that he's going to raise tariffs up to 60%. He will continue with that Biden administration's small yard, high fence strategy in terms of kneecapping Chinese digital aspirations and the rest of it. What role do you think he would want India to play, which also brings in the issue of how effective he would want Quad to be? Now, we know that India has reached out to China through SCO also, and they're trying to sort of calm the line of actual control. So there have been a few tweaks here and there with reference to that. Do you think and the Indians have constantly been talking over the last 4 years, they've been talking about a multipolar world and the rest of it. Do you think Trump will put more pressure as part of his China policy on India in order for India to decide which camp it wants to throw its weight in?
I think the big question mark in this deal or no deal world we're entering into is if Trump proceeds on additional pressure on the Chinese economy, additional tariffs, What's the collateral damage of that for states that have extensive trading or investment relationships with India? And that is both India and Pakistan. India, you can look about, in a lot of Indian products rely extensively on Chinese parts. There's a lot of reflagged, nominally Indian photovoltaics that are really Chinese in origin. India periodically has issues with the US on that now. I think it could be more so in the future. You could imagine a tightened sanctions regime against China or Iran, frankly, that has collateral damage on India and Pakistan, both states that want to pursue trading and relationships. Now, India, part of the reasons it's attracted to BRICS, part of the reasons it's attracted to SCO is because it wants to create currency and other arrangements to insulate itself from US pressure. That's a slow-moving process, and I think there could be some bumps there. With all that said, I may be a little less clear about the trajectory between the US and China because Trump's advisors from last time say he was really committed to trying to get the largest trade deal of all time with China. Trump likes to he hated NAFTA and then he renamed it and loved it, right? So it is not out of the question, to me at least, that Trump could try to find a deal. Now, whether that deal is practicable under the current political economy arrangements in China is not clear to me. But even on China, which I think is the area, the country with which he has the greatest coherence of thought, that China has been pulling one over on us, if Trump could save us by having a deal, I think he might be interested in that because the tariffs are probably going to cause another inflationary spiral. And we just saw what happens to US presidents that trigger inflationary spirals. It doesn't turn out very well for them.
But he likes the idea of tariffs. But you make a very interesting point, Chris. And I want to sort of extend this, purely speculative, in terms of how he makes deals. And I mentioned Wayne Barrett's book, which is frankly a definitive book in terms of how he made these deals, how the Trump Tower happened, and how he almost lost his money and how he regained it, and through whatever means. Well, to the extent of that book, it seems that you're talking about someone who doesn't have a single scrupulous bone in his body, frankly. But he's the president of the United States. So let's assume he wants that big deal with China. Do you think, given his other tendency of pulling the US back from its global commitments, that he would accept if Russia has its own kind of Monroe Doctrine or China has its own kind of Monroe Doctrine until everyone is left to their own devices? You really think, again, it's purely speculative. I have absolutely no idea why I'm saying this, but I just wanted to put it on the table.
Let me, to go back to something Marc said, right? Like one theory, one issue that in the advance of the Ukraine war was a long discussion about whether or not we would deny any European state agency of its willingness and ability to affiliate with NATO and NATO's ability to accept it. We would foreclose that, because to do so would be to deny them some sovereign rights, some agency that they should have in the world. I don't think Trump thinks about the world like that at all. I don't think he cares. The only person that has agency in Trump's universe is Trump. And everybody else only gets agency to the extent that's beneficial to Trump. So I don't view his worldview as incompatible with a sphere of influence, except for the extent that it impinges directly in a very concrete way on a U.S. concern. And probably not just a U.S. concern, but a specific Trumpian concern. And that does mean that deals are on the table that another U.S. president that had some philosophy of international politics or a philosophy that was less mercantilist and kind of crude, deals are on the table that aren't normally on the table for be that for a Joe Biden or a normal run-of-the-mill Republican that has some investment in kind of waving their hands at the liberal international order as not some bad thing.
Since you also work in non-proliferation and disarmament, I'm going to, before closing the program, I'll get to that also. But Ilhan, since you are the historian here, give us a long durée of this. How do you essentially connect these dots? I mean, Marc has already said that there are these tectonic plates pushing against each other. How would you connect the dots?
Well, I would basically say that the world is becoming more difficult for any single power to manage. And the single power that was in a position to manage it after the fall of the Soviet Union has itself undertaken certain domestic policy decisions and choices that have led to its own internal polarization and a hollowing out of its middle class and its working class, rendering it vulnerable to a kind of, I wouldn't call it fascist, but certainly right-wing demagoguery type of a takeover. So you have a very interesting situation where an internal crisis within the United States is now coming to a head. Because when you look at, for instance, Trump's policy for the United States itself, you see that a lot of it has to do with dismantling, as he sees it, the existing security, intelligence, and foreign policy establishment government. So that will be a very interesting thing in terms of whether the United States will be able to conduct any really effective diplomacy if Trump seriously pursues those ends, which are laid out in very great detail in, for example, the Project 2025 document, Mandate for Leadership, and where you have statements from Trump himself talking about the need to essentially dismantle the DC bureaucrats and their allied intelligentsia and make way for a really democratically controlled foreign policy, which of course what he means is that a foreign policy that is deinstitutionalized, that is run at the whim, at the discretion of the President of the United States with marginal or minimal professional input. So I think that will also be a very interesting trend as far as post-inaugural situation is going to be in the US. So, these two trends are kind of coming together, that there is a internal crisis of the American domestic institutions and the political discourse, and there is an increasingly unmanageable world. And you may then see the United States forced into essentially rationing its strategic power, its strategic interests across multiple regions. So I think that if you look at a long-term threat to the overall supremacy of the United States, it's not China or it's not Iran or Russia. It is very clearly China in terms of the domestic strength and potential of a strategic competitor. So it would be very interesting to see if at some point in the next few years, the United States is then forced to, ration its existing commitments in order to focus on one threat and essentially abandon or recess its intervention in other parts of the world, which would then, of course, create a situation where new powers or new forces would have a chance to emerge. So it'll be a very interesting thing. But I think Trump, in this respect, is both domestically and internationally a very important transitional figure as far as our century is concerned.
So, are you suggesting that what he's likely to do at home will further polarize the United States internally and also impact how the US deals with the external world?
I think that a lot of his domestic agenda and a lot of his domestic discourse is built upon the bogeyman of the crypto leftist policy elite based in DC and in the federal government, and dismantling that elite now that he has a clear mandate and quite possibly a unified control of government is something which will have a very profound impact on the United States if he carries through with it. And that will naturally create a problem in terms of the conduct of US policy abroad as well, if the American president is effectively waging a political struggle or a political war upon the same organs of the American state machinery that are responsible for the discharge of US foreign policy and security and military affairs.
Right. So, Barbara, last time we know there were a number of his staffers who would actually pick up important policy papers from his table, because presumably he was taking decisions that they thought were not particularly advantageous to the United States. I mean, Woodward has written about it, various other people have written about this. So we know that this is a fact. He's also talked about his generals as being idiots and the rest of it. And given what he's been saying, given what Ilhan is explaining, do you think that this time he will bring in a cabinet that does not really have any real grounding in the Beltway policy-making circles or the US military or the academia, mostly people from the business world, perhaps, or at least from those walks of life, which cannot really be, which he has been essentially dissing as part of that traditional elite?
Yeah, I think his ability to destroy what we call the blob in Washington,
Yeah, that's the term.
the foreign policy consensus, it remains to be seen. If we look at some of the names that are popping up now for various positions, a lot of them are part of that establishment. I mean, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State is one of the names that's mentioned. If he goes to Vivek Ramaswamy, that would be a change for sure, and he's been mentioned as well. But Elise Stefanik is a congresswoman. She's going to be our UN ambassador. Other names that have come up are all part of the establishment. His chief of staff is a longtime Republican operative, Susie Wiles, who is very close to the Bushes and worked with Jeb Bush in Florida. It's very difficult to extricate a lot of these people. The last thing I was reading on X before I came on this program talked about a revolt in the Senate where there are a number of MAGA types who are trying to push forward a new majority leader, Rick Scott, who's a very conservative senator, former governor from Florida. And there's a pushback on that because the Senate is an institution that is very, very protective of its prerogatives. And most of the Republican caucus in the Senate wants someone like John Thune or John Cornyn, who are old school and who will not always listen to Trump. I mean, they will try to accommodate him, obviously, but they are different from MAGA. So, you have to watch this play out. There's a lot of resilience within these institutions.
Oh, of course. I mean,
he can't, if he tries to order American soldiers to attack protesters in the streets, we will have chaos in this country. If he tries to mobilize the military to deport migrants en masse, we will have chaos in this country. There will be resistance to that, I can assure you. So we have to wait and see. He will pick his opportunities. He will do some of the things he promised, other things I think not. And so let's wait and see what the cabinet is that he proposes. How disruptive he intends to be. He wants to be successful. This is his second and final term as president. He does not want it to be as chaotic as his first term, and he wants to get something done. So that will require compromise.
Well, that's an optimistic assessment. I agree with you. I mean, these institutions cannot be unraveled overnight, but Trump would, because, one of the things that, I don't know if you'll agree with me or Chris will agree with me, but from where I stand, one of the things that I've noted, and this isn't this time, it started with 2016, when he kind of gate crashed the GOP. And since then, he has basically, the right-wing fringe, or the Tea Partyists, if you will, he's pulled them in as the mainstream. And the traditional Republicans have become the fringe in, some way or the other, in terms of how Trump's following perceives them. So there's going to be, but from what you have said, it seems to me that at the very least, he might do certain things which will be disruptive and which will create chaos. I remember Lindsey Graham previously, I think it was 2015 or something, called him a wrecking ball. That famous Miley Cyrus song. So, and I think it was Jeb Bush who talked about him being the chaos candidate who's going to become the chaos president. So yeah, something has to be said about Trump's penchant for disrupting things. But very quickly, since I'm moving towards the closure, Marc, in the coming 4 to 5 months, and I know, one should never ask people to predict. It's difficult to extrapolate into the future. But how do you think Europe is going to respond if Trump actually comes up with a deal that we have been talking about in terms of Russia keeping what it has, a demilitarized zone, Ukraine never to be part of NATO, and Ukraine exists as a rump state? So that's one. And the second is, of course, the internal domestic politicking in various EU countries, which seem to be moving towards the right.
Well, the first question is very easy to answer. If Trump makes a deal, Europe's going to fall in line, period. So that's
Okay.
a short answer. The internal politics is a longer one. I think, we can talk around in circles about the new right and their new strength and what their appeal is and what they may do. But I think at some point we also have to look inward, and we have to acknowledge that the real weakness is actually within the liberal camp. I think that as an ideology, but also as an economic model, as a social model, as a political model, liberalism has exhausted itself. Both on the global level, which has to do with this return of and the rise of other great powers with different ideas of order, but also internally. And I think we have to basically regain that strength. There is an ideological crisis which came to a head, basically the idea that after the end of neoliberalism in 2008, progressive neoliberalism, or the Californian ideology, this weird mix of the Berkeley liberalism in the cultural realm, and as well as the Silicon Valley ideology, it's not really, doesn't have any electoral appeal, and it's not really able to explain the world and give guidance in this new world. And I mean, if you look to Germany right now, we're going to have exactly the same question. There's going to be an election which will be decided by this question. It's like, how can a country which has not only doubled down, but maybe tripled down on this whole idea of the peace dividend of interdependency, of basically integrating itself deep into an open world economy, because that will bring prosperity and peace, right? And now all of this is falling apart. You have a protectionist world that's emerging. You have walls coming up. You have blocks emerging, right? You have great power politics. How can a country like that in a continent that is basically founded upon treaties, like Europe is a rule-based order for real, right? And it cannot survive in a world without rules. So how can a continent, how can a country survive in this dog-eat-dog world that's emerging? That's the real question. And there are wildly different answers to that. To a certain degree, it's refreshing because it's been very stale. The Merkel years have been stale and stagnant in that sense. There were no ideas. Everything was no alternative, right? But, politics is back with a vengeance. And I think it's going to be quite exciting time for Europe.
Yeah, it's always back with a vengeance. Before I close the program and go to Chris, Ilhan, you want to say something quickly about liberalism and neoliberalism and the fact that it's kind of exhausted itself?
Oh my goodness. I think you have to do a separate program if you just want to get into that. But very briefly and bluntly, I think that every power, when it is at its peak, attempts to impose its epistemology on how we try and understand the world. And the United States is no different in this respect. The problem is that an epistemology derived primarily from power and not an understanding of reality is ultimately bound to fail in the face of a changing reality. And it is that unraveling that we are now confronted by. So, as other powers emerge, they will have different ways of seeing the world and different ways of thinking about the order that suits them and suits their values and suits their interests. And of course, in this context, the failure of liberal ideology, in whatever incarnation we wish to refer to it as, to deliver domestically and also to prevail at a principal level so that it wins voluntary adherence internationally is something which again will bring out these contradictions. And it seems as if that these contradictions are likely to assert themselves potentially very violently in the next 5 to 10 years.
That's not a very optimistic prognosis, but but I tend to agree with you. So, Chris, to bombs and bullets, I haven't seen anything that convinces me that Trump is particularly concerned about the unraveling of the disarmament regimes or mechanisms, or might not. I mean, he even, in a way, he's kind of pushed Iran towards greater reliance on nuclear weapons by walking out of JCPOA. You really think that he's concerned about this at all?
So I think it's quite clear we're not going to have meaningful progress on disarmament under the next Trump administration. We didn't even really have it under the Biden administration, right? Despite Bonnie Jenkins, others waking up every morning and seeming to care about these issues, the reality is we wound up in a situation where we told China, told Russia we had a lot of advantages over them that we wanted to amplify. We said that for a while. Not really clear to me why that was such a portion of our messaging about deterrence, but it was. And then China and Russia decided to run a race, and the U.S. has not abstained from at least starting to jog in that race. So we have that going on. I would say the biggest danger as I look out, in part because I agree with Barbara that Iran is in a very weakened place. I used to think Iran might be the biggest danger as we look at the global nonproliferation regime. That is downweighted a little bit in my estimation. I think the big danger may be the U.S. now, because there has been a constituency within the Republican Party for my entire adult life that wants to return to nuclear testing. And I think that constituency is around. I think there are fewer people in the Republican Party that want to not do it. And I think the U.S. could very easily, under the Trump administration, decide it needed to make steps toward that. We're going to probably, it seems like very possible that the North Koreans may test again. But North Korea as a rogue state has not been sufficient to give other countries kind of the normative permission to test again. But as you know, your next door neighbor would probably like to test. China would. So two of your next door neighbors, China would probably like to test. And so if any powerful state were to test again, I think we would be off to the races. And the one relatively rare norm that we've managed to enact in the global nonproliferation system, I think, is going to be under some stress over the next 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the US tests, that norm actually breaks. And as far as our eastern neighbor is concerned, some of their top strategists, like Ashley Tellis and others, as you know, been talking about the fact that perhaps India needs to modernize its arsenal, and perhaps India needs to. I mean, he's written an entire book on that.
Well, Ashley's an American strategist, but there are obviously those that are
American strategists. Yes. that's a technical point in the sense that, but it's correct. So anyway, so the point really is that he believes that India will have to do that, and he's not the only one. There are others also. In which case, it's not just going to be internal chaos; it's going to be external chaos also, and complete chaos when it comes to the non-proliferation and non-testing regimes. But thank you so much, Barbara, Marc, Chris, Ilhan, for your insights. And this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, frankly, but it's certainly going to make me happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussions. So until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.